Football is actually in a much better position because they know when the revenue sources are going to come in and how much money they're going to have before the season even starts. I'd say growth potential, but I am an accountant, right? I should be saying something like exciting and fun and interesting, and it is all of these things, but I'm an accountant, so I'm going to go with growth potential. For the governing bodies to close those loopholes down, rather than the clubs to kind of go, oh, well, there's a loophole, but we're not going to use it. Of course you're going to use it if it's there, right? Is that club making a profit? Is that club going to be able to keep running unless that owner keeps on pumping money in? I never really thought about this, which you'd think I should have done. I'd invest in something lower down the pyramid, but with potential, with history.
Welcome back to the Football Economy, the podcast where we explore the strategy, finance, and policy decisions shaping the future of the global game. I'm your host, Ibrahim. Today's guest is someone who sits at the intersection of sports, finance, and policy reform. Dr. Christina is an associate professor in accounting, sport finance at the University of Portsmouth. She's also a qualified accountant, forensic accountant, a lecturer, and her work has directly informed the UK government's decisions on football governance. So without further ado, welcome Christina to the Football Economy.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Perfect. So before we dive into the podcast, I would like to ask you first of all, what was the moment in your life when you realized football and finance weren't just career prospects or interest, but something you had to dedicate yourself to?
It's a really good question. I have to admit, I came quite late to putting the two things together. I've always been a sport fan. I've always played. I've always watched. I love football from a very, very young age. And then I became an accountant, and I never thought the two worlds would collide. And it was about a decade ago now where there was an epiphany, and it's been quite interesting to see how the market has changed and how much, because of the commercial growth, because of all the differences that we're kind of seeing in the market, how much football finance has actually taken off as something that, is being taken seriously.
Yeah. That's a fair point. So, well, in terms of financial sustainability, because you mentioned football finance, which is why we're here today, we know that it's well communicated to the whole industry that football has a sort of sustainability problem in terms of finance. And despite record revenues, which is quite strange for an industry, why do you think so many clubs are still operating in loss from a granular lens in that sense?
It's a really good question. I think ultimately, because how clubs are viewed by some ownership groups where they feel that they're happy to keep pumping money in, even though the clubs are loss making. Others kind of see it as, well, if clubs go into administration because the fan base is there, and most of us that are kind of interested in the area are fans as well. So we appreciate that, you wouldn't go exactly and to support your opposing team if your team went under, right? So there's that kind of ready-baked consumer base that always kind of exists. And I think that doesn't help in terms of the financial sustainability thinking. Obviously, in terms of the rules, they haven't been in place for that long. We kind of talk about FFP, which doesn't exist in that form anymore. It's now financial regulations, but that didn't come in until 2011. So, it's more kind of something that people haven't been thinking about. And I think it's suddenly on people's consciousness because the sums have suddenly become so big, because the competition has become so great. And if you're at the top of that competition, the revenues are just extraordinary compared to where they used to be. So it's become quite an important thing to think about the financial side more than it used to be. It used to be, I'm happy to keep kind of pumping in money to sustain my local club because it's my local club. But the ownership groups are very rarely the fans anymore. They're very rarely rich fans anymore even. We've kind of moved beyond that. And so there's been a bit of a change in terms of what's important from a financial perspective where clubs are concerned.
Understood. And then doing research on you, it's clear that you're very well versed and well integrated into sort of like advising the government, or irrespective of what government is in place, in terms of the Department for Culture, Media and Sports. I know that you also worked on financial health indicators. So my question to you here is like, what metrics do you think, so if a club owner is watching, do you think club owners and potentially the football regulator in this place, David, who is going to be the independent football regulator, should be watching? What are those key metrics, would you say?
Yeah, I think so. We did, me and one of my colleagues from Liverpool University, Kieran Maguire, we worked with the government, DCMS, which is the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, and did a review effectively of the financial industry in the football industry in the UK, looking at the top. Initially, it was the top 4 tiers, and then they kind of expanded. The regulators now looking at the top 5 tiers. So the second report, we looked at the top 5 tiers of English football, men's professional football. And we kind of started at it from a sort of basic accounting investor perspective, right? What do you look at? What's important financially? Step 1 is looking at what is it that why do clubs go under? Well, number one reason ultimately is cash flow, right? You don't have your cash to pay your debts when they come due. That is why ultimately clubs go under, because like we've said earlier, the fan base is there. The customer base doesn't change. It's not as if you've lost that. What you have lost is that ability to pay your debts when they come due. So cash flow is a really, really important one. Kind of looking at that. When we did our analysis, obviously we only had public information to lean on. So it wasn't always possible to get all the information necessary to kind of look at that. But obviously if you're internal, or if you've got access to the data, if you're looking to buy something, then obviously you've got access to the data room. You would be looking at these kind of things. So operating cash flow and cash flow in general, kind of really important, or other liquidity metrics. So we used the current ratio, quick and dirty, but it works in that sense. So that's kind of looking at the liquidity side, which is quite important. Other things you kind of want to look at, surprisingly, we looked at equity, just straight equity, and we found, surprisingly, so the last report was for 2023, although we've run the numbers for year ending 2024, and they're not much better. And in the top 5 tiers of English professional men's football, over half had negative equity, which means they're technically insolvent, which means you have to have an ownership base that is happy to, I always think about it like the old fashioned kind of engineers in the old coal powered trains, shoveling in money into this burner. But it's very much like that. And that's over half of clubs. That's quite insane. So that's not really a metric per se, but it is something to look at, whether you're solvent or not. So that's quite useful. Other things, we kind of used wage to turnover ratio as well. Just that kind of links in with regulations, UEFA regulations. Obviously, teams that don't play in UEFA competitions don't have to abide by UEFA regulations. But we used the kind of 70% UEFA regulations, which is what they're kind of moving to under their new financial regulations anyway, just to kind of keep an eye on that. And we found some really interesting things, particularly in the English Championship, which is the second tier of English football. That was the worst in terms of wage to turnover ratio. And a lot of that was to do with this push to try and to go to promotion. We kind of looked at the numbers over, about a decade and a half, and the majority of those years, the average wage to turnover revenue was over 100% for the championship, which is insane if you think about it, right? Because that's just wages. That's not all the maintenance costs, all the other things that you need to pay to run a club. That's just wages. And I think the worst one was over 200% for a couple of years. So that's, that's not where you want to be as a club, really. However much money you have to pump into an organization, that's not something you want to look at. But yeah, generally I'd look at liquidity, because where football clubs do quite well is that customer base is there. So long as you have that kind of fan engagement, so long as you keep your fans, that money, at least some of that money should be kind of coming in. You then have to look at some other things, that kind of more business sense type stuff. So one of the metrics we looked at was proportion of revenue coming from a single source. So for example, we looked at, for the Premier League, we looked at percentage of revenue coming from broadcasting. And what we found was the lower down the the league you were, the more dependent on broadcasting revenue the clubs were. So those kind of things is just thinking about, normal business stuff. Do you want to just be reliant on a single source of revenue, and then something happens like you are in the French league and then suddenly that broadcasting money isn't there? Or do you want to spread your income sources around? And it's those kind of things that you want to look at just to make sure that A, you're in line with kind of reasonable business practice, and B, that you're in line with your competitors to some degree. Although sometimes that's problematic because they look at their competitors and they go, for example, in the championship, they look at their competitors and they go, well, everybody's got a negative operating cash flow. Everybody's got negative equity. Well, not everybody, but almost everybody, right? It's fine. But yeah, not really fine.
Yeah, what you're saying is basically it's a very dangerous game to play. Relying on one central source of income, but also not looking at potentially trying to find means or potential ways to actually make the institution, which is a football club, raise sustainable revenue, which allows it to become profitable over time. But the other thing I would like to ask is, where does the football net debt come into play when it comes to assessing the potentially risk assessments of a football club?
Yeah, so football net debt is an interesting one. So we use net debt. So we did use football net debt as one of the kind of metrics we looked at in the report. And the reason we used that was to look at effectively the interplay between football clubs. Because what you find is that there are a lot of football clubs, particularly in relation to transfers, that owe a lot of money to other football clubs. And if that other football club that owes you a lot of money because from, transfers that happened in January transfer window or last summer or the summer before that, because the way that, the payments are structured, if they can't pay because they've gone into administration, then you're in trouble. So again, it's part of that looking at the risk. What risks are there to a football club? And the majority are cash flow, what your competitors are doing and how much they owe you, and what kind of financial kind of health they're in compared to you, and also looking at your revenue sources and whether they're secure. Where football is lucky compared to a lot of other industries is that you pretty much know what you're putting aside issues like the French league where they thought they had money coming in and it just is no longer forthcoming. You generally know how much you're going to be getting from broadcasting and when that's going to be coming in. You know how much you're going to be getting from tickets because roughly how many season tickets you've sold, and what capacity is generally for your club, and how much you're going to be selling tickets for. So you have a good idea of how much money will be coming in during the season from match day events. And then the commercial deals are mostly sewn up before the season starts. So compared to other businesses where they don't know what's going to happen, football is actually in a much better position because they know when the revenue sources are going to come in and how much money they're going to have before the season even starts. So surely in some ways they should be better run than a lot of other businesses because where your issues are, when your pinch points are going to be. We're not getting another revenue chunk until, January or whatever. So therefore we need to be a bit more careful in December, or because what that profile looks like. But the issue is a lot of football clubs look at their competitors, look at what they think they need to do on the pitch, and then that impacts how much money comes out of their account. So, if you look at a lot of the sort of financial metrics. So Deloitte do one every year. What do they look at? They look at revenue. They look at how much money coming in. That's not the same as looking at financial sustainability. Is that club making a profit? Is that club going to be able to keep running unless that owner keeps on pumping money in? And in most cases, the answer is they're really dependent on the ownership. And that's a problem when that ownership stops pumping money in because their other businesses aren't doing so well, or because they lose interest, or because, something bad happens to them and then their heirs or whatever are not interested in football. We've seen all of these, right? We've seen all of these. And then you see the problems arising from the lack of financial sustainability, and nobody is willing to pump that money in.
So, in terms of, first of all, I think you've mentioned basically clubs have issues when it comes to aggressively budgeting towards unrealized revenue, which potentially could be another different box that we don't want to open in terms of like clubs, maybe potentially not living in reality, or people who operate those clubs. But the question I have for you now is about governance. And you kind of hinted at it with what's going on in France. So I think recently just came out that basically they are going to be abolishing clubs being able to integrate revenue that is coming from broadcasting revenue in that sense. Obviously, because like you mentioned, the clubs don't potentially realize that revenue because broadcasting rights get folded or don't actually come to realization. So my question to you here in the UK, where do you think that balance can be struck? Because we know that clubs, potentially amortize some clubs, I should say, amortize their player costs in a different format to other clubs. And if that's going on, that club has a potential advantage over other clubs because then they can obviously realize losses over time that the other clubs can't do, which gives them a competitive advantage on the field. So where do you think governance comes into play when it comes to accounts and loopholes, like I just hinted at?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, this might be because prior to being in academia, I worked in practice, right, as a forensic accountant. So my view has always been, well, if there's a loophole, there's a loophole. That's that's why accountants are paid money to look for the loopholes, right? And it is for the governing bodies to close those loopholes down rather than the clubs to kind of go, well, there's a loophole, but we're not going to use it. Of course you're going to use it if it's there, right? And you see it. So I think there's that kind of interesting balance. I think where it is important is you need people, particularly when we're talking about regulation and thinking about those loopholes, is about consistency. So making sure that everybody is effectively reporting the same thing. And we don't necessarily see that. So in the UK, we're very lucky that all clubs, because they're mostly private limited companies based in the UK, they have to publish their accounts and they're all available on something called Companies House. So you can kind of have a look at everything, which is quite interesting. Because you can see that, even there, the format of the accounts and what different people classify can be quite different. Then if you start looking at the rules, so for example, if you look at the Premier League's PSR rules, their profitability and sustainability rules, and you go, they're all in the Premier League handbook. You go to the Premier League handbook, you have a look. A lot of that stuff is not very clearly defined. So, the first thing I would do if I was an accountant working for a club or a lawyer, I'd just go, well, this is all the stuff that we can put in this category. What is, spending on community? What is, there's always stuff that can be done. So I think some of the issues are because of the clubs, and I think some of the issues are there because of the regulation. And I think, again, I feel that the football industry has almost been taken, even though it's been building commercially very quickly and steadily for, decades now, it still almost feels like they've been taken by surprise. So litigation, particularly kind of big litigation cases, I mean, we're seeing cases at the moment, around financial regulation and kind of monitoring, and a lot of lawyers involved. We didn't really used to see that in the past. And why? Because the numbers weren't so big and people who owned clubs weren't quite as interested in the sort of backroom stuff. It was more about what happens on the pitch. But the way kind of investment has changed, now a lot of it is about what's happening kind of profit-wise as well as what's happening on the pitch, even though there's obviously a link between the two, because the more money you have to spend, the better on average you do on the pitch. Obviously, it doesn't quite work perfectly that way, but there is a very high correlation between the two.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's an interesting one, right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I was going to just interject and say, I think the Athletic, Matt Slater, who I think basically reported that because of the independent football regulator being deployed soon, basically Premier League is going to be deploying £4 million to basically have their own resources, basically staff, work with that independent regulator. And that's money that could be going to stadium maintenance and, the youth team and community development. So my question to you is, although we're trying to basically rethink the financial rules, are we not losing sight on potentially modernizing the people who actually dictate these financial rules in terms of like improving the processes they work with, in terms of like staffing them up? I know, we also potentially modernizing that process, because it does seem to me that the Premier League or the clubs themselves vastly superior in resources, which is clear to everyone. But in terms of being able to dictate what happens in a court of law, it's almost like an off balance. It's not balanced in any way, and that's going to continue going towards the league and towards the clubs in that sense. So where do we then start saying, well, the people who are doing the regulating or who are actually refereeing the game itself in the English pyramid should be modernized, should be looked at for sort of like evaluation, and who should be evaluating them in that sense?
It's a really good point. I mean, starting with the kind of 4 million put aside by the Premier League, having looked at what happened last year, 50 million they spent on legal fees, mainly against in the various battles that they've had against Man City. I think that tells you quite a lot about the state of the friction that exists between the members of the Premier, because ultimately, who is the Premier League owned by? Well, the shareholders are the clubs, right? So effectively, they're infighting against themselves. So a lot of the money that is being spent that should be going to, academies, as you said, women's teams, fans, community, stadiums, grassroots, all that stuff that, is why we love the game anyway, right? A lot of that has just gone into legal fees and infighting. And I think there's that kind of balance between trying to make sure that you modernize but also that you have good governance while you're modernizing, to make sure that, a part of this idea of getting a regulator in is to make sure that clubs are run in a better way with better governance, more financially sustainable. And then hopefully that means you get rid of some of the tensions between the leagues and the clubs. And then you get rid of some of all these extra costs ultimately that are being deployed in just infighting. On the other hand, like you say, you're going to need some money to then potentially test the regulator in some areas, because it is an area where you kind of have to be practical as well. Kind of from my understanding of the way the regulation is looking, it seems to have the right tone in terms of working with the clubs, advocacy, making sure that, smaller clubs effectively have less compliance that is required of them, which would therefore make sense. So therefore they'd have lower costs. But it is a balance, and it's not an easy one. And I think, no regulation is perfect. That's why UEFA keep tweaking theirs every couple of years, right? That's why every piece of legislation has been tested in court multiple times and from various angles. I guess the issue is, where is the industry now financially? It's not a very healthy place to be. So the question is having a regulator better than not having a regulator? And I think that's where the question really, really is. But I think once the regulator comes in, which seems very likely now, there is a lot of work to be done to make sure that that balance is right.
Yeah, this is correct. And I really do agree with you. But I know that you've written a lot about private equity and institutional capital entering football. And we all know this is now like a mainstay in football industry. So my question to you, when it comes to private equity and private capital, we know that we live in a globalized world. We know the current state of the US and the current state of Europe and the eastern part of the world. What do you think is the sort of like the macro effect when it comes to interest rates rising potentially in the future on the states of private equity entrance into the English Premier League now and in the future?
It's really, really interesting point. And there's a lot of, it's not just interest rates, it's the economy as a whole, it's exchange rates. I mean, for example, part of the reason why the Premier League, well, actually the English leagues, it's not just the Premier League, have seen quite a lot of American money coming in. It's been the exchange rates have been favorable for a while, not quite the case anymore, but that's where the kind of market has been. So there's a lot of kind of political turmoil, always kind of in some ways helps, because like you say, it's a global market. So if there is political turmoil or economic turmoil or issues in a particular country, some of the super rich would kind of divest their funds or move their money to invest in other countries. And that kind of can help not just English, but European football, because the area has been more stable than some other regions. There's so much stuff that comes into this. And particularly when you're talking about private equity, ultimately, what is their goal? Well, the good things, people always talk about, particularly from fans, it's always the bad parts of private equity. And there's quite a lot from a fan perspective, but there's also the kind of positives that private equity can bring. There, again, it's a balance, right? It's a balance between sort of bringing in innovation, bringing in new ideas, kind of moving stuff, demographics change, people's interests change, consumption changes. I mean, I've got kids, the way they consume football is very different to the way I consume football, particularly sort of online. And when we're in the stadium, it's very similar. But, when you're not in the stadium, it's very, very different. And there's so much change in the industry, and there's more coming, AI, there's so much change coming to the industry. And where I guess private equity find it quite interesting is that you've got an industry here that has quite high revenues, right? But also massive costs and make massive losses. So if you're in the industry of kind of looking at the potential for profit, I can understand why people would look at football and go, well, there's efficiency gains to be made here and profit to be turned around. The issue with football is, in order to make a profit, it needs to be a kind of a long-term investment, long-term plan, particularly because of regulations and because how it sits. But also, there's that balance, because I think part of a lot of the kind of issues that we have seen in football and the clashes between ownership and fans, I think there's a lot of it that's been linked to lack of cultural understanding, perhaps, in some ways. Fan power is very strong in Europe, and, there's generations of fans that have mobilized in the past and are happy to mobilize at we've seen, so in Manchester, you've seen a whole new club come about, FC of Manchester, in response to what happened with the Glazers. So it's really kind of, there's a lot of, in terms of investment, there's a lot of potential, but there's also a lot of pitfalls, which I think need to be thought about if you're looking to invest in football.
Yeah, I mean, what I would say also to add to that is private equity comes with a lot of institutionalized knowledge from other industries, best practices. But outside of that, also they potentially could create sort of like a discipline when it comes to cost management and obviously sound revenue projections, which the football industry generally needs at this moment in time. But obviously, like you mentioned, the sort of like the fear factor when it comes to fan engagement and the intentions of private equity, as we all know, they have, exits of 5 to 8 years or 10 years, depending on the institution. But my question to you now is about sort of like, you did write an excellent paper on resilience and football's sort of like resiliency, or football clubs' resiliency when it comes to other industries or the global economy. So I understood the thesis of the paper, but in this context now, where do you think football's resiliency is going forward with the uncertainty that we see in global markets? Do you still concur with that sort of like conclusion or thesis that some clubs have the potential to obviously be not correlated with other industries when it comes to having downturns when the global economy?
Yeah, ultimately, so the premise of the paper that you're talking about, we looked at financial resilience and we kind of compared sort of football club profits and their EVA. So we looked at value added effectively to the economy, and we compared that to where the macroeconomic conditions, so where the economy was going, whether it was in recession or whether it was going well. And what we found was that clubs were generally resilient. And I think that kind of the conclusion from that is it's a lot to do with the monopolistic state of clubs. It's back to that you have fans who will, get tattoos on themselves of their club. I mean, who tattoos an Amazon logo on themselves, right? Or these are companies we're talking about, but it is a very, very different, it's a people's business, right? It's got a very strong consumer base and they're stuck in. My team that I support went under, I wouldn't go and support our rivals, even though they're in the same city, right? Because that doesn't happen. And that translates to them being more economic resilient and kind of move less with what's happening in the global economy than others. However, and this is kind of coming back to that private equity point, is football is a people's business, and a lot of other industries can have a lot to bring to particularly efficiency, particularly about kind of backroom running of stuff, etc. But there's also that possibility that you kind of forget that it's a people's business, and therefore the reputational damage that can be caused to particularly an ownership group by fans because of that part of, what makes football so valuable is that they don't follow economic recessions in quite the same way, because that fan base is still there and they're still willing to spend that money. But it also means that you have got a very knowledgeable and very kind of strong-willed consumer base that can cause a lot of trouble for you if you forget that it is a people's business at the end of the day. And I think that's what we've seen in some cases, and that can have that reputational damage. It's not just about, oh, well, it might affect our match day, but somebody else will come. Well, it will also affect your commercial gains, because a lot of companies don't want, particularly in the kind of social media era where everything becomes very obvious very quickly to a very global audience. A lot of commercial companies do not want to be associated with negative publicity. And we have seen it in multiple places. I mean, we've seen it in England, we've seen it in Germany, we've seen it in Italy, we've seen it everywhere, where fans just go, actually, no. And then sponsors get a bit shaky, and even broadcasters get a bit shaky. And that can have massive financial repercussions. So, sometimes it's like, oh, let's make some staff redundant, and you're saving yourself a few million, and then it costs you tens of millions in reputational damage. And that's the kind of balancing act that is sometimes not quite the same as in other industries. So it's the positives of having that sort of resilience to economic recessions and all that kind of issues compared to other industries. But you also have the reason for that is that really strong monopolistic customer base, and that can have sort of negative implications from a profit perspective as well.
Right. Is it possible, just hearing you talk about this sort of like aspect of the monopolistic sort of like behavior of the football industry, is it possible then, I know the private equity, they obviously seem, like you mentioned, are the valued assets of the English football teams or leagues, but an American investor coming into England or coming into Europe, do you think they're seeing the sort of the idea that, okay, there's a high switching cost in this part of the world when it comes to fan bases? So, obviously, if I'm a Manchester United fan, I'm not going to go support, Man City because all of a sudden you're winning, although I do know people who've done that. So that's another topic. But compared to the US, where obviously it's a new market and it's a different demographic, but potentially there's a low switching cost. Potentially, I'm not saying this is based on raw data. Do you think this is something that comes into their, let's say, top of mind when they're doing their, sort of like analysis or due diligence in terms of what clubs to potentially invest in?
Yeah, I think we're seeing almost a kind of change in terms of thinking that's not across the board. Obviously, we've seen recent issues with clubs as well where that is the case. But I think there is an education piece that has happened, because I think a lot of people look at some of the issues that have come about and they go, well, this was going really well and they were still making money and it's fine. And then it starts not going very fine. And if you're in there for 8 to 10 years, it's almost, you're kind of hitting that long-term effect whereby if you don't invest sufficiently, if you don't keep fans on side sufficiently, you're not going to be able to sustain your position in the league. And therefore, you're not going to be able to sustain the kind of revenues that you would have done in the past. And therefore, that capital appreciation aspect, which is what most private equity kind of go in for, that's not necessarily going to be there if it doesn't happen in the right way, right? I mean, you can look at Wrexham, for example. There's been a lot of, yes, obviously there's the Hollywood glamour and stuff, but there's also been a lot of engagement with the fans and almost kind of going on a journey together. And I think that's where a lot of the kind of success, particularly short-term success stories that we've seen, have been in that kind of manner, because otherwise we have seen some less successful, particularly from a financial standpoint, because if you're making mass losses, you can't take money out of the club, right, as an ownership base, and the capital appreciation aspect goes down. If you've been relegated, you had a Premier League team and now you have a League One team or even a Championship team, you're not going to be able to get the same kind of money when you sell it on, right? So that's part of the jeopardy aspect, and that's part of the risk. And that's why some of the conversations we've seen, particularly where American ownership has been concerned or American private equity, a lot of them have been talking about, getting rid of promotion and relegation. But then again, then you're back to the kind of fan point where the fans are saying, we're happy with certain changes, but that's something that, is part of the fabric of society and part of the fabric of football. And there's a lot of pushback to those kind of ideas, because ultimately, what do closed leagues bring that open leagues don't? And actually a good example is to look at kind of women's football, right? Look at the NWSL compared to the Women's Super League. What does closed league bring? Well, it brings that lack of risk, yeah. But then it also brings a lack of competition unless you can do something to manufacture that competition. And what you have in traditional US sports is the draft, right? But then you look at what's happened with the NWSL, they're suddenly facing competition from a different league. They're within their own country. They're facing competition from the WSL because a lot of players are moving across. And what's happened in the last CBA, they've got rid of the draft. So then you start thinking, well, what's that going to do to long-term, valuations at the moment are going up. But long term, if that affects competitive balance, if there's only going to be one team or two teams that are always winning the league, then it stops being as interesting. And then people stop being as interested, stop watching, particularly where there isn't that massive history, particularly where there isn't that sort of generations of fans that have kind of, your great grandfather or great grandmother supported this club, right? And then you're in kind of shaky water because broadcasters aren't interested, commercial income, what sponsors or partnerships would be interested in that. Fans aren't interested, so your match day goes down. You're in trouble.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so it's sort of an interesting insight that you made, several you've made actually. So, for instance, when I look at the American graphic or as a sort of like economic model, it's all focused on capitalistic activities, and obviously the foundation is based on capitalism. But then in Europe, you can say it's fair to say it's not as capitalistic, more on the socialist end. When it comes to the sports league, specifically the EPL, compared to the other institutions or leagues in the US, it's like the opposite. So which is like a very, sort of like ironic, sort of like a framework on both sides. But then my question leads into this sort of like the women's remarkable growth of valuation growing, and also a sort of like momentum that we see when it comes to women's football league, both in the US and both in Europe. My question to you is, I can see from the research I've done that there's sort of like a disparity, actual disparity growing between the haves and the have-nots, specifically in England, where you see women affiliated clubs obviously moving apart. There's a big gap growing as a result of that. I know there's a lot of talk about, well, women clubs should be independent from the men, but clearly there's benefit from being affiliated to the men, which from my understanding, is causing a lot of like you said, in the league potentially at the startup stage, not being as potentially competitive as it could be. This very, very nascent stage. What would your understanding? From your understanding, what would your take be about that? Like, what are we looking at currently? Where should we be mitigating for risk? And just sort of educate me on that sense.
Yeah, this is a big topic. This is probably a whole podcast worth of a conversation.
We can do another one if you want. It's fine.
Yeah. I mean, so there's a number of issues that kind of come into play. Right. There is, so we did a piece where we looked at financial sustainability in women's football, and we kind of looked at how much and what we saw in the WSL since it started was, revenues have skyrocketed, as you said, but so has debt, so have costs and wages. And one of the kind of things that we looked at is position compared to spending. And what was quite interesting was what we found was particularly the affiliated teams, the ones that were kind of consistently doing well in the WSL throughout its history, there was less of a correlation between their spending and how well they did on the pitch and how much money they were making, right? Compared to the ones that were had just come up or came up for a couple of seasons and kind of went back down. And they were very much dependent, their revenues were very much dependent on how well they did on the pitch. And part of that is the brand value. So what you're kind of finding is that particularly with affiliated teams have not necessarily like, people talk about crossover fans. That's part of it. But part of it is also that kind of building on that brand that already exists and pulling in effectively a demographic that has been to a large extent excluded from football for a very long time. So you're effectively growing your brand by bringing in this kind of affiliated team. And that's worked really well. We know that commercial revenues form the majority in the WSL. It's the majority of the income. So it's the biggest source, not the majority of the income. It's the biggest source is commercial revenue compared to men's football, where, it's often broadcasting. If we're looking Premier League, so if we're comparing top league with top league. So commercial is really, really big source of income. And that leverages off the brand, right? That's part of the brand. What's really interesting in women's football is they're not just leveraging off the brand in terms of the traditional men's football sponsors and partners. What we're seeing is a kind of movement towards bringing in sponsors that haven't been previously engaged with footballs. For example, Arsenal have a deal with Il Maquillage, which is a makeup company. Obviously haven't had that before. Sunderland have got a deal with Nubi, which is a baby brand company. Haven't really had that before. Como Women in Italy have had deals with Sports Bra, but again, not before. Man City have recently done a deal with a period pants company. Obviously haven't had that in men's football before. So there's quite a sort of movement in terms of not just only leveraging the brand, but also leveraging the demographic of the fans that you've managed to pull in to watching football. So that's one thing. The other thing is that the affiliated clubs have also helped part of this massive growth. Because if you look at where is the money in the WSL, who does really well financially? Arsenal do, right? Why do they do that? Have a look at their match day income, right? Why is their match day income so large? No, because now they play almost all their matches at the Emirates, right? Yep. And so you can have a lot more people coming in, and it's not just about the kind of the stadium size, it's also about the stadium accessibility, particularly using that traditional men's stadium. They tend to be in easily accessible places with really good transport links because you have to be, because it's been decades of having to deal with capacity crowds on match day. So it's all kind of organized, which if you're just starting up and you're a non-affiliated team like London City Lionesses, you have to either rent your stadium or you need to, which is what they're looking to do, is build a new stadium. But that comes with where are we going to put it? How is it going to have all these accessible transport links to make sure people want to come, right? And you can't leverage in the same way off stuff that already exists. You have to pay for it. If you're not non-affiliated team, you need to pay for your stadium. You need to pay for your marketing team. You can't use what exists already at club level. So part of the growth in women's football has been accelerated in England and in Europe generally by leaning on the club resources of the men's side. And that's what's been able to, look at the top teams in the Women's Champions League. They're all affiliated teams. It's that kind of being able to use those. So it's a very difficult thing. Then you have, and that's the final one, is something like London City Lionesses, where they've gone for a completely different model. They've gone, we recognize we're a non-affiliated team, but what we're going to do is we're going to create an MCO. We're going to do it, works very well in men's football, but we are going to make sure that the priority is women's football for the clubs that we look after. And therefore, we can kind of leverage off efficiencies that aren't normally looked at, because the priority for affiliated teams are never the women's team, because they don't make most of the money, because they haven't existed for as long. They haven't been there as long. There hasn't been, there's also been bans and all sorts of stuff that have hampered women's football for decades and centuries, right? So, but what London City Lionesses have done, which is part of that kind of multi-club ownership group with Olympique Lyonnais, is look at the kind of foundations, right? What is it that can give us a competitive advantage in the women's football space? Is A, make the team a priority. So we're not kind of thinking, well, are we going to continue this year? Our men's team got relegated, so we're going to cut funding to the women's team, right? Which we've seen multiple times, right? There's also the kind of using efficiency gains across the multi-club ownership model. So you can use, some of the same directors and some of the central functions. So you're effectively having that sort of backroom staff very kind of similar to if you were part of a club, an affiliated team as part of a club. You're just part of an MCO where you can kind of use the same resources across 3 clubs. So you're kind of very similar sort of placed in that sense. And then it's the focusing stuff on women's only. So, a lot of the London City Lionesses and Olympique Lyonnais ownership group is looking at, how can we get better out of female athletes? What are the issues? Why do we have ACL injuries far more prominent in women's football? What can we do about it to make sure our team does better than everybody else's? So I kind of think that it's very difficult if you're not affiliated or not part of a multi-club ownership group. It's becoming harder and harder to compete at the top level in Europe.
Yeah, it's well understood. But you mentioned Lionesses, you mentioned the Olympique Lyon and Arsenal. I do know the Chelsea women, obviously Ted Bowley, who runs, his group runs Chelsea, has obviously not divested, but they become a separate entity in terms of corporate structure from the men's team. So for the teams in England, for instance, do you think that's potentially sort of like the model they could potentially follow, at least the clubs that are affiliated with the men's team? Do you think that's potentially something they could follow, or is it more like a wait and see? Let's see how they do first with their commercialization activities, or with their revenues, with their other activities. Let's see how it works out for them before we jump in. What's your
Well, my take is that not much has actually happened in that kind of corporate structure shift. If you look at the WSL, all the women's teams in the WSL are separate legal entities, right? So if you're looking, because I'm so exciting, I look at all their accounts, they're all separate legal entities. So it's literally a matter of where Chelsea sit, which it used to be under the men's team, and now they're under the holding company. So they've just literally just restructured internally. In terms of being a separate legal entity, there hasn't been that much change. Now, I don't work at Chelsea. I don't know what the internal structures are, right? So perhaps changing where that company sits in the company structure might be helpful to them internally in terms of how they allocate resources, and to kind of help allocate resources in a better way than they have done in the past. That could well be a gain of what they've done. But in terms of it being sort of groundbreaking and different, there hasn't really been much change. Where we have seen something groundbreaking and different is with Olympique Lyonnais, where the women's team is now majority owned by a separate group to what the main men's club is. And that's a very different structure, because and it's a very interesting structure, but we have seen things like that before. I mean, I'm a Panathinaikos fan, so there's, Panathinaikos football, Panathinaikos basketball, Panathinaikos volleyball. They're all owned by different people, but they're all come under the same banner, right? And you see that a lot, Barcelona, Real Madrid, like throughout kind of particularly Southern Europe. It's not uncommon to have that structure. So in a sense, it is groundbreaking, and in a sense, you're just almost replicating what's happened in some other sports in Southern Europe, which is effectively you're treating it as a different sport and kind of keeping under that one brand banner, so you get the benefits of the brand, but have different people running it, so you have different priorities, and that allows, the Michelle Can Group, Kinistra, to actually focus on the women's team, which you wouldn't necessarily have if it had stayed under the same ownership as it had previously been.
Yeah, it's an interesting sort of like perspective, and I do agree with you. Like the multi-ownership model, and also sharing synergies, and also obviously benefiting from the branding, potential, or the branding power of a sort of like the men's team could potentially be used for Arsenal to go forward as a women's standalone team. So that's like obviously very key for momentum and growth for women's football to be built upon. But my question to you now is around sort of like a soft salary cap of 40% of revenue. I mean, that's kind of interesting to begin with. And I know that you've mentioned that the women's team should be considered or seen from a lens of a startup, which makes sense. But do you think that this sort of salary cap could be a hindrance or barrier to the sort of like the growth goal of the clubs in and of itself, and also of the league itself?
Yeah, it's that balancing act with making sure that there is financial sustainability versus making sure there's competitive balance. We're back to this issue, and the problem is there is no there is no answer to this. Nobody's got it right. UEFA doesn't have it right. DCMS doesn't have it right. The Premier League don't have it right. The EFL doesn't have it right. Nobody's got it right because it's really hard to manage to get there. And I think the Premier League are the closest, if we look at Europe, in terms of getting it right, where you've got an open league with promotion and relegation. In that, if we take away a few of the more kind of recent times, you've had a whole bunch of different teams that have been competing at the top, and also a whole bunch of teams that have been competing at the bottom for relegation, right? So there's been that competitive balance, there's been that jeopardy, there's been that interest, compared to, say, Germany, where they've really struggled to have more than one big team for a while. Obviously, not everything goes perfectly every season, right? But it's a very different thing, and that is reflected in broadcast revenues particularly, but other things as well. Part of why the Premier League is so above everybody else is because they've managed for a while to get that balance better than some other clubs. But coming back to your point on women's football, what a soft salary cap does, and I mean, the thing is, it's low enough to sort of almost dampen some of the effect of this. But so, for example, when UEFA brought in their financial regulation back in 2010, 2011, and it was initially called financial fair play, which is why everybody calls it FFP. Hasn't been, the fair play bit was dropped fairly soon after. It's been financial regulations for a while. And part of that is because what a soft cap does, or what a cap of any, effectively, they've got collar, don't they, in UEFA, or have done up until recently. And what that does is it kind of holds in those that were at the top at the time. Yeah, because you've got the biggest revenues, and therefore you can, that's what a soft cap does, right? It kind of closes in that that competitive balance to that league. You were at the top, you were making loads of revenue, so you can spend more, and therefore you're above the rest, and therefore you continue to be above the rest, and it kind of it's an upward cycle in that sense. But I always find it really, really interesting, because you also have, that's particularly men's football, and particularly if you look at things like Champions League, how that has kind of evolved over the years, and what that has meant for competitive balance, particularly for, teams from smaller leagues, or teams that, their leagues haven't been as competitive in the past, and how that's kind of translated. In terms of the women's side, the problem is a soft cap creates side effects, right? Because it dampens competitive balance to a degree. If you have a hard cap, which, some leagues have tried, so rugby union in the UK, in England, you get that wrong. Everybody uses it as target practice. And then we're back to what we were talking about at the start of this conversation, where, financial sustainability just doesn't exist, because everybody's going, well, it's a hard cap, so I'm just going to spend, doesn't matter how much I'm earning down here, but I'm going to spend until what I'm allowed to. And then that creates a massive issue unless you set the cap right, which then creates problems, because where is right? Because then you can hamper ambition, right? And we talked about innovation and how that can kind of breed more revenue sources and different changes. So it's a very, very complicated thing. And, trial and error is effectively what UEFA have been using for years in relation to financial regulations, what kind of works, what doesn't. And I think that's That's all you can do at the moment because there's just so many factors that come into play. The problem that women's football has is we're already seeing sort of breakaway, effectively league above the rest. And then everybody else is not really in competition. And that can be bad for long-term sustainability and long-term interest in the league, right? So, the choice is, how do you change the regulations to make sure that you bring up some of those teams that at the moment aren't competing? Because it feels like two different leagues. If you watch WSL, right, you've got Arsenal, you've got Man City, you've got Man U, and then it all kind of Chelsea, obviously, and then it all kind of starts dropping a bit after that, and it's not the same, and that's problematic. And we've seen that across men's leagues for decades now, and how that affects things like commercial revenues, how that affects broadcasting rights for the league. And it almost feels like you're making the same mistakes again instead of learning from. We've got over 100 years of history to kind of look back on and sort of build, and definitely a few decades of proper commercial entities and commercial nous in football. We should be able to kind of learn from our mistakes. And I think sometimes it feels that the learning process is slower than it should be.
Yeah, this is definitely a good point, and I definitely concur. I agree with you. So almost rounding up the episode, but I do have one last question before we move to our rapid fire round. So I know that the Women's Euro 2025 is coming up, and then also the 2027 FIFA World Cup, which is going to be held in Brazil, if I'm not mistaken. How do you foresee sort of the global expansion of women's football? We've spoken about America, and obviously Europe, but how do you see the influx of capital and the expansion of global football and women's football and so global women's football being affected in sort of the emerging markets, sort of like South America in that sense?
I think, again, it's about showcasing the commercial potential, because we know that the commercial potential exists in the US. We know that it exists in the UK. We know that it exists at the top end of Europe, right? Because we've seen it. We've seen what happened. We've seen the kind of commercial revenue skyrocket. We've seen that kind of movement. I think where international events are really good is for kind of showcasing some of that to emerging markets and to other people where the kind of women's football hasn't been a priority, and actually being able to showcase the commercial benefits and the commercial potential, particularly of investing some money, because in many ways it is a startup league. You're not, but also in many ways, I kind of feel like it's a bit of a, you're investing in a different market, but you're diversifying your portfolio within a single brand. And that's very hard to find elsewhere in industry, right? Where you can be effectively in two markets at once. You can be in a sort of startup market, which is where women's football is in most of the globe, and then, kind of traditional, mature men's football market under one brand. I mean, that's really hard to find anywhere else. So I think the big events, and we have seen how some of these big events have really kind of pushed and changed perceptions within the country, and particularly where people hold the purse strings. I mean, that's where, so Euro 2022 was really kind of groundbreaking in England. A lot of it was, look, we're filling stadiums. Oh, so we can do that at a club level then. Yeah, of course it takes some investment, and it hasn't been sort of straight sailing. It hasn't been, perfect, but it has pushed that agenda. And I think that's where those events are actually really, really good. From that perspective, it's just showcasing the commercial potential of women's football to certain markets that haven't really thought about it as something that has commercial potential, and haven't seen it as a priority, and haven't seen it as anything that's kind of worth investing in. Actually seeing the global brands involved, seeing how much money is actually starting to move into women's football, and start thinking, actually, yeah, I do want a piece of that pie. Maybe I should invest and kind of be part of this movement. So yeah, I think they are very, very good for that, particularly with, you always get a little bit of a bounce, right? After any kind of major event in any sport, you have a bit of a bounce. People are interested in participating, people are interested in watching. What Euro 2022 showed very, very kind of very well was that ability to kind of keep that momentum going, sort of, yeah, we've got interest now. People are interested. People are watching. People are playing. Roots clubs. Okay, let's pump money in now. Keep that momentum going. Look, they're coming to the stadiums. Oh, look, investors are interested. Oh, look, sponsors are interested. Oh, look at all these partnerships that we're kind of getting involved in. Look at how the revenues are growing. And that is a really kind of good message to give to the world, and that's where those kind of global events are really, really useful.
Yeah, I mean, like from an individual perspective, I'm very, very sort of like stoked to see the momentum build into actual growth that is sustainable over time. So, I would like to obviously follow the industry and obviously the developments that go into that industry specifically to women's football. So, having said that, I definitely think that if you would have me, I'll definitely want to explore having like a specific woman-focused episode just to explore the recent developments and also the potential, sort of like challenges that should be focused on. But let's transition to the rapid-fire question round. Basically, I'll ask you a question and you tell me what comes to mind first. Great. So my first question would be, without focusing on the club that you support, if you could invest in any football club right now, which one would it be and why?
Oh, this is a really difficult question. I never really thought about this, which you'd think I should have done. I'd invest in something lower down the pyramid, but with potential, with history. I was just reading an article on Deportivo La Coruña, and I was just talking about, I remember watching them play Panathinaikos in the Champions League, right? Club with history. Obviously, I'm not saying that that's the team I would kind of pump money into, but I think I would look at a giant that's kind of gone down a little bit and that still has that history, still got that kind of potential commercial clout, but it'd be much cheaper if you kind of invest when it's not quite in its glory days. I wouldn't invest in the Premier League, even if I had all the money in the world, because, it's a money pit where, the capital appreciation there would be much lower than if you kind of took something. Obviously the guys at Wrexham knew what they were doing. Take them out of the bottom where there's no financial regulation and push them up. But yeah, I would invest. I would look at further down the pyramid in Europe where, it's a stable market, but also quite a lot of potential. But honest answer, I wouldn't invest in football because I wouldn't want to lose my money.
Yeah, that's an honest answer. And then, yeah, just to reinforce the points, I do agree that. So first of all, history is key. I mean, even private equity can buy history, but also, that's also like a distressed asset in that sense. I think AC Milan and Inter Milan are sort of like case studies for that. So the next question I have is basically, looking at your experience, you have like this forensic accounting experience, and what would you say would be the sort of like underlooked risk that football isn't looking at right now?
Probably environmental sustainability, because I think there is a lot of potential risk from climate change, and I think there's also a lot of potential risk from regulation. We've seen it, it's coming in various markets, and I think football are not really thinking about it much. But from a financial perspective, if you don't deal with it early, the costs could potentially become prohibitive further down the line. So for me, that's a big potential risk that is not being looked at sufficiently, I think, at the moment.
I completely agree with you. And then the final question would be, in your opinion, what's women's football in one word?
Oh, I'd say growth potential, but I am an accountant, right? I should be saying something like exciting and fun and interesting, and it is all of these things, but I'm an accountant, so I'm going to go with growth potential.
Perfect. Awesome. And Christina, thank you so much. This has been incredibly insightful, and thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Perfect. And that was Dr. Christina on the football economy. We covered football's financial fault lines, the governance gap, the rise of private equity in football, and how the women's game is basically growing and commercializing and finding its own model. Don't forget to subscribe and join us next time as we continue to decode the business of football and sports in general. Thank you.